periodically back in August of last year. That represents a 40-year low in tax-exempt interest rates. And then after the election, interest rates are starting to come up a little bit, and then they've jogged back down a little bit.
You locked us last year, though, right?
I'm sorry?
You locked our rate last year, though.
No. So the way it works is we do the due diligence, we do the S&P rating, because if we would have locked last year, you would have gotten the proceeds too. And we need to size the bonds correctly based on the bids that come in, so we're not over borrowing the amount or not under borrowing. We're going to size it just perfectly for what the bids occur.
You've done this chart on a double A, a Standard & Poor's double A. How different would this chart look if we were a BAA or a lower grade than that?
Right. Again, this is just an index, and it's also has a maturity of 20 years. So your borrowing cost is estimated to be actually less than this, even though you're not necessarily a AA rating. You probably, we're assuming just for our numbers that you're in the A-rated category. But because you're going to, if we do a 20-year financing for you, your average life, because you pay off principal periodically over that 20 years, is actually less than 20. It's probably about 13, 14 years. So your borrowing cost is going to be less than this, even though your rating is assumed to be a little lower. But to answer your question specifically, the difference between a AA rating and an A rating is about 20 basis points, 0.2%. And the difference between an A rating and a BAA rating, which is the next category down, but still investment grade in our world, is another 20 to 25 basis points. So, following up on the mayor's comment about locking in interest rates, we're not set to lock in interest rates until we price the bonds. And that pricing date, back on page 1, you'll see it's estimated to be, it says bond order period on June 8th. That's the date that we actually price the bonds to, it's called a public offering. They're sold to all across the country to the lowest interest rates. And that's the date that the rates will be locked in and finalized. So we can change that based on market conditions, but that's just the date that we're targeting right now.
Right, and just so that you know, there's a lot of plates spinning, so we're looking at the bid opening either in May or June.
Right, we'll just move it accordingly. So since the election, of course, we've had interest rates have been going up. The stock market again hit all-time high today. I don't know if you followed that. So there's been a little more confidence in profits for corporate groups since the election. And so that, when you have more confidence, and we're seeing the unemployment rate is still very, very low, you know, those conditions are not necessarily market friendly for bonds. That's why we've seen interest rates go up a little bit since the election. Because typically in the bond world, we like bad news. If there's a war, instability, Brexit, back in August of 2016, that's when Brexit happened. And the British decided to announce that they were going to exit. So what that meant was a flight to quality. A lot of people sent money to the United States, bought U.S. treasuries when those type of events occur, because we are the safe haven of the world, even though you may hear differently in the news accounts. The United States is still the most financially strong, the safe haven of the world. Where there's instability, money flows to the United States, and when it's a supply-demand relationship, and so when that happens, that means interest rates go down, because you don't need to put higher yields to attract investors. So that's why the 40-year yield occurred back in August of last year. Okay, let's talk about you specifically. And this was just a snapshot on page 4 of when we ran numbers last week. And so if you look at this is kind of a sources and uses of funds. And one of the assumptions, the main assumption that we're running with, if you go under uses, it says project fund deposits, $8.3 million. That's what we're using right now as our hold point for what proceeds you need for your project. Those will be finalized when you have your bids. And then you have to pay for cost of issuance, underwriter's discount. But in today's world, investors are paying more than 100% for bonds, because interest rates are still very low. They're still not far from 40-year lows. And so investors want to pay up and pay more than par for bonds. And so In today's world, that meant a premium of about $500,000. So you'd actually, if we would have priced the bonds last week, you would have issued only 7.915 million of bonds to fund $8.3 million. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a good thing, but the market changes every day. And so these numbers, this is just a snapshot as of last week. Okay, so now let's get to the other part, the details, page 5. And this is just what we call a pricing report. There's a lot of numbers on this page. Bottom line is that we're assuming that you'd like a 20-year level payment structure for your bond issue. And bonds are sold incrementally. We pick out principal bonds and market those to investors. So they're sold by year. And so each year has a different interest rate, but your blended rate is what you pay. And so as an example, if you go to the yield column, you'll see that the yield estimates vary from 1.2% to 3.4% in 2037. You've got a blended rate of your financing in today's world of 3.42%, and that's fixed over 20 years. And that includes all amortized cost of issuance. So your total estimate, that would be your borrowing cost in today's world, 3.42. Your actual debt service is shown on page 6. And on the far right-hand column, you'll see you have a small payment at the end of this year, and then your payment is about $580,000 per year through 2037. Your treasurer and I have been in contact. He's done a lot of pro forma numbers for the financing, looking at different sources of funds to pay the bonds. A lot of that information will be in the prospectus and the official statement as we go forward. And before I hand it off to Alice, can I answer any questions about the bond market or our schedule?
If the market was wonderful or our economy was wonderful, can we pay these off early?
Yes. Good point. So
That's the callable portion, right?
the callable portion, that's a good point. So if you go to page 5, you'll see the call date section on the far right. So municipal bonds, new issue bonds, when they're sold to the public, the standard is that they have what we call a 10-year par call. That means you promise to the bondholders that you're not going to call and pay it off, redeem their bonds for a 10-year period. At any time after that period, you could call them, redeem them, any portion of them, without penalty. And so when we ran the numbers, we assumed, actually it's a little less than a 10-year call because we were going to close this till June, yet you'd have a 12/1/2026 par call. And that is very standard for the market. 10-year call. So if you come into a bunch of money, and it makes economic sense to pay off these bonds based on the market at that time, you'd have the flexibility to do so. You could call the long bonds, you could call any of the bonds after 12/1/26. Well, that'll introduce Alice to talk a little bit about kind of some of the process, and then I think she may mention a few things about the action item. There's only one action item that the council will need to pass, and that is the delegation bond ordinance, which would come before you, in a number of months.
So, thank you. I've put together a little bit of a, just kind of an overview talking about taking a step back and talking about the bond issuance process in general. So this is sort of a very high-level overview, and I just want to kind of take a step back and make sure we're all kind of on the same page about how this will work. My goal here is to be able to answer any questions and make sure that you understand kind of what the city's going into, understand what the city's agreeing to going forward, what the restrictions are, kind of how the whole process is gonna work. And so I want it to really be useful for you, so please feel free to ask questions as we go on. Really what I wanted to focus on is, as elected officials, what are the tools you need to be able to make a good decision about debt for your city? And I think there's really two primary categories to think about at that level, really understanding, kind of how to interpret all the jargon and know which questions to ask to be useful, and to really know how to focus in on what the decision-making process really is. And then understand what the mechanical process is and what's to be expected in terms of your role as the city council members, Alan's role as the city treasurer, staff's role in this process. So that's kind of my goal for how I want to walk through all of this. Really when folks start talking about debt, the really key pieces for the elected officials to really grasp are making sure you're comfortable that this is a project you want to bond finance. It's something that's appropriate for long-term financing. Typically good capital infrastructure pieces like this, like a road improvement project that has a long useful life that many people in the community are going to use. It makes a lot of sense to spread that cost over the people who will use it for the life of that particular project. And so that's, really typically one of the real policy arguments behind what you choose to bond finance versus what you choose to use the cash that you have from today's taxpayers versus spreading the cost among the taxpayers who will, kind of be in your city using that piece of infrastructure over time. And so, what you've got here, this road widening project, and you've got a mix of, revenues and resources that are going into it, it makes a lot of sense. It's a really good candidate for debt financing. And the next question I really like to, kind of help people think about is when you issue debt, we're talking about issuing tax-exempt bonds. So now to layer on this sort of federal tax component of it, anytime you do something with tax-exempt bonds, you layer a level of, restriction on what you do with it. For a road project, you're not going to have any problems. Those are really good governmental projects. Where I run into problems are when people want to finance a new building and they want to put in a parking garage and they might want to have a Starbucks down on the first floor, and you've got mixed components where you've got some retail and some other users, that you want to have use the building that you've just built. And so those are the ones where we are really concerned, and we want to make sure people understand, is this a good project for tax-exempt financing? Here, again, you guys have a road project that is a good governmental project for getting the lowest cost of borrowing possible and issuing tax-exempt bonds for. So that's kind of the second thing I tend to walk people through when you're really thinking about, is this where we want to go with this project? And then the next big picture question that I help council members focus on is sort of, do we understand what the sources of repaying this are over time? Are we comfortable as a governing body, as a decision-making body, that we know what resources the city is committing to this over time? So the way this bond issue has been talked about and structured so far, it would be a general obligation bond, which means that the city will be pledging its full faith and credit. So it'll be pledging property tax revenues primarily, and then some additional, whatever other additional revenues you want to be dedicated specifically to paying for this. And so the treasurer's really mapped out a really good plan for what portion of this would be expected to come from property taxes, and then what the other sources are, real estate excise tax, and then a small portion, I believe, is intended to come from the storm and surface water utility. And so what we'll do, even though this is going to be a general obligation bond, as we structure the bond issue, we'll take that into account, and knowing that the utility will then pay over a portion every year, sized to be sort of proportionate to which components of that project are really eligible to be financed as part of that drainage, the stormwater improvements that'll be going into it. Does that make sense to everybody? So we'll have this sort of combination of resources going in. So really, I think that understanding at that level is what's really, key as an elected official, to be able to say, okay, we understand, it's a general obligation pledge. The city is going to be paying for it from a variety of sources, and we understand what the expectations are for those resources that'll have to be committed over the next 20 years to pay for that. Okay. So moving on, the next sort of slide here is I usually like to talk with people just about who the different players are in the bond financing transaction. And Dave gave you a good listing of specifically who the individuals are. But sort of to set the table, sort of on the city side of the table, you've got, the elected officials, all of you, and the executive branch. And then you've got your finance officer, your treasurer, you've got the city attorneys involved, and then, the division or project manager. So you have all of those players working together, along with the bond council, to sort of be at the city side of the table. Dave provides incredibly useful advice. He wears the hat as the other party, as the underwriter, who comes in and buys the bonds from the city and provides the cash. And then he resells the bonds then on the market to individual investors. And so that's sort of on the other side. And occasionally they'll bring in separate counsel. We've worked with Dave before. I'm not sure if Dave's going to be using separate counsel.
We're not.
No. So the other parties that you'll see kind of at the table, and which you saw listed on the contact sheet, are the trustee or paying agent, and that's U.S. Bank right now, that has the state fiscal contract, the rating agencies, and then you might have other types of consultants that are sometimes involved in a bond issue, but this will be pretty straightforward. So there shouldn't be too many other people buzzing around the table. Questions about any of those? Who the players are?
If sometimes cities or municipalities or entities will hire a separate financial advisor. And in our case, I don't think that's necessary, and I haven't suggested that because, as you heard, this is a pretty straightforward process, road project. We know how much we need, and we're going to pledge basically our sales tax. So we really don't need that kind of advice. So there would be somebody that we don't employ. We don't pay $30,000 for somebody to walk us through it.
And sometimes, as Alice mentioned, our council, we typically have counsel for revenue bond issues, but not for councilmatic LTGO bond issues. So I'm not hiring another attorney to represent us for those things.
Yeah, and in some transactions, folks will hire another attorney to do disclosure work. And that is to work on the official statement and the prospectus and work on securities issues. And so nobody's proposing that a separate lawyer come in to do that for this transaction. I'll look at it on behalf of the city and work with the city staff on it. Dave's shop is preparing it. And so we'll have, sort of a collaborative set of eyes on it from that perspective.
And you're both regulated.
Highly.
And that is true. Very much so.
And so my next little slide there was actually the role of bond counsel. So what to expect from me and what I do in this transaction. So as the city's lawyer, I'm basically looking at three different things on this project. I rely on Sharon to do the general municipal, yes, we can do this, it's a road project and we've got the authority to do this kind of thing. What I'm looking at is any other state law issues that specifically relate to how you borrow and issue the debt. So I'm checking for procedural things like Open Public Meetings Act and making sure you publish notice of meetings and things like that, but also debt limits and those kinds of issues that relate specifically to how the city borrows money. So that's the state law side. And then I'm also looking at two federal aspects, and one is the securities law side and one is the federal tax. And as I started with the tax issues, anytime you're issuing tax-exempt bonds, there are certain restrictions that go along with that. And the primary one to think about is that it's really for a governmental purpose, and that the primary user of the finance facility will be a governmental entity. And as long as we kind of check those two boxes, most of it is pretty straightforward in terms of the federal tax laws. There are a number of issues that follow up sort of after the project is financed and built, making sure, and this all kind of falls within the treasurer's office, tracking how fast the money is spent. The IRS cares about that, so they want to make sure that you are borrowing the money very close in time to when you want to spend the money. They don't want you to borrow it now, invest it, make a whole bunch of, earn a bunch of interest on it, and then spend it a number of years later. So we will be timing this bond issue, so we'll be very close to, what the construction and the cash flow needs are for the project. That also minimizes the interest cost to you as a practical matter. And so those all kind of relate to the tax issues that we'll be working on. And we'll be developing tax documents and things like that with the Treasurer's Office. And then on the securities law side, we're focusing mostly on the disclosure documents, and in 2 phases. One, really looking at the initial disclosure. So when the bonds are first marketed by Dave and his team, there's a prospectus or an official statement that's prepared that describes really kind of a lot of information just about the city's ability to pay for the bonds, what, and it goes from everything from sort of how government is working here, what form of government you have, all the way through pension disclosure and pension obligations and things like that. So it's a very wide-ranging document. I encourage you, when you see a copy of it, to read it. Most elected officials say, gosh, I learned some stuff when I really delved into it. But it is a really, really excellent summary of sort of just general information about how the city is working and what's happening in the city. And so at the end of the day, we look at those 3 issues: state law, federal securities law, federal tax law. And then we provide what's known as sort of in the industry as the unqualified legal opinion, or the bond opinion. And it's a written letter, and it's in a pretty standard form that's accepted by most people who are purchasing the bonds. But it rises to a level that you don't very often see from attorneys, which is that we have to be firmly convinced that the highest court in the land, being properly briefed on the issue, would agree with our conclusion. So mostly when you get a lawyer to give you an opinion, they say, well, more likely than not, or, we think this is probably how it would go. But as bond counsel, we're held to a very much higher standard. We call it sort of the 99.99999% standard. And so that's what the city is getting from bond counsel. And so by that nature, we're often more conservative than advice you might get, from your city attorney, who's advising you whether or not you should do a project, and you're asking, well, we just need to know whether more likely than not we should, we can do this, and there might not be a really bright line about this is exactly the only way you can do it. But that's, in my role as bond counsel, we sometimes end up taking the most conservative position possible on different issues. Again, with your project, it's very straightforward, so we don't anticipate issues.
And that's because these bonds will be sold and resold and be in the open market, in the bond market that's all across the country. So the chances of one person buying this and owning it for 20 years is probably not likely. It will continue to be sold. And we'll have to do continuing disclosure as
Yep.
well.
And so that's the second phase of sort of the disclosure work that we look at. So we look at that initial document that goes out there, and then once you've published that information, your bonds are sold based on that information, and they're out there, and people buy and sell them all the time to one another. And so what the SEC, the federal government and the SEC have done is they've said to the underwriters, they can't buy your bonds in the first place unless you agree to go out there and update that information at least annually. And so the city will enter into what's known as a continuing disclosure agreement, which will require filing of your annual financial information on a website that is maintained by the MSRB every year. So there'll be that. And then there's a list of several sort of listed events, certain events that they say, if these important things happen, you have to also tell the bond market. And so there's a certain level of monitoring and diligence that has to happen as long as those bonds are out there. But there are things like a bankruptcy, a ratings change, a default. They're big kind of events and things like that. But that's something that within the Treasurer's Office has to be then monitored for the next 20 years. But it's a relatively simple process. But that is also part of the whole disclosure regime. Once you issue tax-exempt bonds and you sell them to the municipal market, you do take on certain responsibilities. And so that's, handling this disclosure, and then back again on the tax side, continuing to comply with the tax regulations for as long as those bonds are out there. That all makes sense? Okay. So just a quick process sort of overview. What we will do, back to the schedule that Dave had presented to you earlier, the next real step that you as the elected officials will be part of is we're developing a bond ordinance, which is a rather long, 30-some pages ordinance. which I'm writing, which you guys will take a look at, and it's scheduled to be adopted around the time that the bid on the construction is awarded. So what we will do is we will know what the amount you need to borrow is so that we can put it into that ordinance, and then once we have those pieces of information, we can bring that ordinance to you. And the ordinance will then be what's known as a delegation ordinance. So you as the council members will authorize the maximum principal amount that the city can borrow. You'll have parameters for what interest rates you're interested in. So if, the market goes crazy between the time, you all authorize it and the time we can get to the market with it, we might postpone the sale if the interest rates are not within those parameters that you specified. So that will be in the document. The document will also specify the maximum term of the bonds. So 20 years is what we're working off of now. And so those really key terms will be in there. And then what it will do is basically delegate the authority to work out the nitty-gritty details of it to Alan, Dave, and the team working together to get the best, lowest interest cost for the city that's available in the market on that date. And so the council's actions will be to consider that ordinance on that date, and then after that, it will be really in the hands of the team to sort of carry out that borrowing, and then come back to you with the, yay, we got the money. So that's going to be sort of the next thing. So once the delegation ordinance has been adopted, we're working on sort of a parallel track here to get the disclosure documents together. I know Dave's already been working with the treasurer's office to get a lot of the information that's necessary, and that'll start to be reviewed. And then, so once the ordinance has been passed, then they'll be scheduled for rating presentations and starting to distribute that official statement out to the market, and scheduling then the pricing date, which is when the interest rates will be locked in. And then following up on that, between the date that the bonds are actually sold to the market or locked in at those interest rates, then my office will be preparing closing documents that'll be signed by various city officials, and then we'll proceed to closing within it'll probably be, it's usually about 2 weeks after the pricing date, so probably all in what the schedule is looking at is about 30 days after you authorize it. Hopefully we'll be able to say we're closed, and the closing is the date when you actually have the cash in the city's coffers.
Just question out of curiosity more than anything. You've got about a 30-day window between the bid opening and the bond funding arriving. What happens if during that 30 days we find out that the low bidder, for one reason or another, doesn't qualify? In our due diligence of signing the contract, we find out for some reason they can't. We have to go to the second, who happens to be higher. Can you make adjustments to the bond amount at that point, or is it too late?
Yeah, that'll be a good question for when we are authorizing the ordinance. What we normally do with a delegation where there's a little bit of wiggle room, and there's wiggle room for not knowing what the market will do and how much premium might be generated, so you don't know. What Dave's gonna try to do is size it to a particular project fund deposit. But what we do in the ordinance is we set usually a not to exceed par amount. So we might end up with an ordinance that authorizes up to, $8 million or even a little more cushion as a maximum par amount, knowing that, the amount that actually gets issued will be sized exactly to meet what you need as a project fund deposit.
So you
at the
have
end of
some
the day.
wiggle room.
Yeah, typically in the documents, we kind of star the principal amount. It says preliminary subject to change. And so it's very common that on the pricing date, hopefully by the date we get to the quote pricing date when we market the bonds, that we know what the final number is, and we can just size around it.
Yeah.
And so we can just adjust the pricing date to meet your schedule, so you are comfortable with the first bidder or the second bidder, or
Yeah, and worst case scenario, your first and second bidders drop out, and the third bid is really a lot higher. With the delegation ordinance, we can move the pricing date around, and if we had to, we could come back to you and say we need to amend and make it 8.2 million or something, if necessary.
Thank you.
I have a questions? Yes,
Would
ma'am.
there, and I imagine this has already been discussed, but should Port Orchard become a code city, would there be any problem with any of this, anything that have to be done
Procedurally?
differently?
Yeah, no, the debt statutes for both code cities and for second-class cities are mostly the same. Really, the difference for me is at what meeting you can approve debt issuances. As a second-class city, you must do it at a regular meeting. As a code city, you could do it at a regular or a special meeting. So that just gives more flexibility. But in terms of debt capacity, in terms of all the other issues, there's really no difference between the two types.
99% chance we'll be issuing these bonds before we could take action on it, being a code city.
Yeah. No, it's a great question.
Well, some of the heavy lifting we'll need to do is really dial down on how much is storm drainage utility. And we'll need to work on that to make sure that, because we will be taking debt service from a utility, we'll want to make sure that we have identified that. We're going to use a portion of the TIB, Transportation Benefit District money too, about $50,000 for the payment as well. It's allowed. So we'll dial in on that as well.
Our lobbying effort last week, we're still asking for $2 million from the legislature is our ask. And one of the twists that we put on it last week in our ask was we've got $2.2 million in storm drainage. If the transportation dollars are extremely difficult, we're being told to get, if it needs to be a water quality ask related to this transportation project, we'll take $2 million any way we can get it, so. But it's a long shot that we're gonna get an award from Olympia, but.
Can we justify $2 million worth of water quality effort?
There's $2.2 million in stormwater improvements in this project.
Okay.
Yeah, because Tremont has zero water quality or quantity, and because we have Ross Creek and Johnson Creek on either outfall, we have enhanced treatment requirements on both ends of the project.
And we'll have to dial down pretty close on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the flexibility, but I just want to make sure we could be in compliance, so. Minor technicality.
So the message on Olympia was we'll take $2 million any way we can get it.
Well, even if some came out of stormwater
Yeah,
and
yeah,
some
so-
came out of transportation, we don't care.
I just was trying to
Right.
give Jan and Jesse and Michelle more tools in their toolbox. Other questions?
No, just this time frame, is that all doable for Alice and Dave to do your work within this time frame?
Yeah, I think it's more the issue of Public Works Department delivering at this point, so. Everything we can do.
Are you getting cold feet, Mark?
No, I'm definitely I'm getting anxious to get out to bid, and I'll be very anxious the day that we open bids. So, yeah.
As will all of us.
Are you going to do that huddled in a corner? Or is it going to be public? when
No,
you open
it'll be
this?
public, and usually a bid of that nature, they'll have all the contractors' reps, and Brandy will be taking the lead. I will be huddled in the corner,
Okay.
yeah, sucking my thumb, probably.
Well, thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I think the good news is that money's available for projects. The bad news is there's money available for projects, so they're busy.
I actually was thinking of that about 15 minutes ago.
So, what did we talk about, how we did that?
It's a whole lot of
That, it's in the budget. Okay. It's a budget amendment.
We end there.
And, I can speak to it now. So
No,
Fred-
please.
So Fred asked a very good question. So at what point, from in the decision tree, are we budgetarily, the cash flow requirements of $600,000 was, when we did the budget process, we had the budget, and then we have a supplemental, member that was part of the budget process. We will have to, very soon here, pass the supplemental budget that's for the Tremont project. And Alan's been working on, there's a couple of things that we could have done it here in the last couple of weeks. We're still working on the Prospect Street property. We went back out to bid and got no bids the second time. We're back out on the street the third time. So it's looking like we should have taken the bid of 125 back at Christmas, but that we thought was too high because we got no bids the second time. So I've made some phone calls to some local builders. Hey, come on, take a look at our project. Everybody's just extremely busy. And we have, payroll certification requirements and prevailing wage requirements that private sector jobs just don't have. And there's a lot of work out there right now. So I've got some assurance that, okay, I'll look at it. And,
We're gonna cast our net a little wider though, because
we're putting it on the Builders
we're gonna
Exchange.
go on a builder's exchange that, maybe there's some people that are in a much smaller fish in a bigger market that need a fill-in job, so.
So it'll be,
I think Friday.
yeah, that's closing here. We'll bring it probably at the end of March. We're gonna bring that award, we hope. We're trying to minimize the number, we aren't doing half dozen budget adjustments, so we're gonna do the supplemental piece, the property across the street, and then we have the numbers for all of our ending cash balances. And so all of those budget adjustments because we're estimating when we're doing the budget in November, so now we have those actual numbers, so.
But Alan probably could come and give us just an idea of where the money is going to come from.
Yeah.
And he did that here a couple of years ago. We had, and I know I still have that documentation, but this is more real now than it was a couple of years ago.
And another piece of the funding gap that we still haven't implemented is the budget, shows the natural gas checks going to the 6%, the same as the
Right.
the electric tax, and I know Sharon's been working on that particular ordinance. So you're gonna see that very soon. So there's a bunch of pieces here that we're gonna bring all together just ahead of this stuff.
I just want the assurance that we have plenty of money to pay for this. It's like we have 600,000, I wouldn't call it extra, but we have that. I mean, and obviously we believe we do, but
We've built a
I
budget.
just wondered where exactly is that coming from?
Yeah.
She mentioned property tax. I thought, okay. So this is 600,000.
It comes out of our regular budget. To answer your question, it comes out of the general fund. There is no special bucket or, account.
No savings account that we.
There's no savings account for it. It comes out of, it's just finding $600,000 in the
So
budget.
you remember, we took the substantial needs because we said we needed every bit of property tax we could get. We know that, it's a stretch, there's no doubt about it, but we've put everything in place we have to succeed. Otherwise, we were borrowing $3.5 million and not having a road to show for it. That'd be a bummer to be paying on that. So,
And he originally did those numbers before we did the transportation benefit district, before we did any impact fees. He did that maybe the first year I was on council, the first or second year I was on
It
council.
would be a bad idea just having dust that off and update it.
Right.
I think we had, as part of kind of the budget process conversations, there is an updated version of that that has honing in more on percentages of water sewer utility that actually can contribute a portion, or they're having to pay for non-federal eligible work, like we're running a sewer line up that isn't required for the project. We're doing it now to have the sewer line there. So sewer will pay for that piece, and then we've got, so we have one section of sewer that the city's paying for just out of the sewer fund. We have the storm drainage piece, which obviously the storm drainage fund can pay for, and then you've got, as Beck said, we've got the TIF and the TBD as a revenue source, and then you've got the taxes and things. So.
I know, and I need to say this out loud, that when we did the Transportation Benefit District and we did the Council-matic $20 car tab, it was kind of important to me that go to our preservation and maintenance and not go to the debt service.
And it can't.
And it can't, but what it does do is it frees up money that we would normally put in preservation.
Right.
And not all of it, because I think we as a council didn't want to reduce the preservation, that we were doing. So Alan, I know, took that all into consideration. It seems to me it was during the budget process that we got a glimpse of how this money was gonna come out,
And
a more current.
It was that supplemental piece.
Yeah.
And I've seen it, I know we all got it, but it was part of a whole bunch of paper we got.
Right.
It was the budget, and it wasn't, we weren't ready to act on it because we hadn't gotten the award until late in the budget process, and so that's where that's at, so, but that was a good question, Fred.
Mark, the engineer's estimate for this project was done a couple days ago, and in light of everything that is going on in the building industry today, are we still comfortable, or should the rest of us go sit in the corner and suck our thumbs with you?
Well, I think the issue is it's a moving target until we actually go out to bid. We have an $18 million total, and you gotta remember that 18 million has within it, it has the actual construction bid that we'll get, and I'm hoping that bid is 12 million or less. That's just the sticks and bricks of the bid. Then we've got our construction administration, construction management, which is gonna be, 1.5 to 2 million. It's a 2-year project. They have a team of 6 or 8 people managing a federal project with traffic going through the middle of it. Then you have the Schedule 74, which we know is about $1 million. Now, we get 60% of that if we complete, so that's good. We've already paid, or the design, so there's a good portion that we're actually gonna get back into the city's coffers that could go back in this bond amount, because we've prepaid 100% of the design and we only are required to pay 40. We have 100% of the transmission relocation cost, but that was in that estimate as well. So that $1 million was in there. So you have the 12, 13 and a half.
2.2 for stormwater.
Right, but that's in the, that's in the 12. And then we've got, there's contingencies, some engineering costs. So we've come up to the 18 million, and there are built-in contingencies in there. I think there's a 10% contingency, which when you're talking, that's a decent.
Yeah, but most of that stuff is going to be there regardless. I mean, you're gonna have to have a contingency regardless of what the bid price is. You're gonna have to have construction management and so on.
Right, so I guess what I'm saying is we've got the 8.3, the 8, and the 1.7, that out of 18. Within that, there are some, obviously, we're gonna be really interested to see that 12 million or less bid.
Right.
But at the same time, the CACM, Construction Administration, Construction Management, will be for the most part, a percentage of that value. So there's some flexibility in that number. The PSE, Schedule 74 relocation costs are pretty fixed at this point. So there are some built-in contingencies in that 18 million. And we've been refining, because we've been working through WashDOT the last month on the public interest finding, on the Division 1 specs, on the plans, making final revisions. So until we get to that point where we actually go out to add, which is time sensitive because of, as I was saying earlier, the size of contractor that we need to get on their docket. But there's a lot of other factors. I mean, what's happening in a worldwide fashion on, this is a lot of asphalt. It's Buy America, so we have to have American steel. And there's a lot of things that are happening on a national level that are gonna fluctuate. And so, that's why I want to get the ad, open the bids, see where we're at, make the final adjustments, and hopefully everything falls in line. I was mentioning to Dave and Alice that, worst case scenario for us is if we didn't get bids out until, say May, and then we didn't open until July, and it was delayed, we may find it more prudent to reject all bids, since we actually have until September 9th, 2018 to obligate construction funding.
Even for TIB?
Well, TIB, we'd have to talk to TIB.
Yeah.
But,
That's a big chunk.
it's $8 million. It's only $8 million. But if they agreed that it was better to go back out to bid in, say, December of 2017 to get the next, work period. So, yeah, we're really pushed up against it, and I
This
don't.
is anticipated to be a 2-year project?
What's that?
This is anticipated to be a 2-year project?
18 to 24 months, yeah. So, yeah, so.
And that was the message we were down in Olympia sharing, was our back's against the wall here. We'll take, we want 2 million, but we'll take anything we can, because we have some unknowns still. Even if we got $1 million or $500,000 from Olympia, we might come in high or low of that mark.
Yeah,
And
that's what it was.
we're,
Right, we have,
8.3 is really about as far as we can, we won't know till we open the bids, and we'll have to just.
our engineer's estimate has most current bid information, but,
Okay,
those
no,
numbers
that
are.
was my original question,
Yeah.
is it really current?
Yeah, this isn't a 2013 number that we've
Okay,
added 25%.
okay, then
This
feel
is,
better.
yeah, they updated here at the end of 2016 as part of the final PS&E. They had to actually make quite a few changes, not a lot, but changed some line items because they had to get in compliance with WashDOT. And at that point, they were looking at fresh, recent bids. Bridger Abraham had a big project in the Port of Tacoma last year, and so, they've got fresh numbers. And so, but until the bids open,
And I presume you go into a process like this, understanding that if you've got to cut, because the bids are just so high that you know what you want to cut. Or does it work like that?
There's nothing we can cut.
Nothing to
Well,
cut.
we-
It's been value engineered.
we went through,
That's how
we
we
did a
got to the number we're at.
constructability VE in 2013 with Exeltech, and then we did a second one as a requirement of the TIB funding, and we cut back on street lighting. WashDOT had a new standard on street lighting, that they actually have reduced lighting, so we were able to meet that. We had reduced landscaping and irrigation.
Sidewalk, we cut some sidewalk.
We took out sidewalks from the South Kitsap emergency entrance there on the west end of the emergency room entrance, from there to 16. We're not doing sidewalks on that side. On the north side, in that same stretch from Canyon Court to the on-ramp at 16, we're changing that from curb gutter and sidewalk and bike lane to a shared use path. So we've done everything that we can do from a VE standpoint to get the costs down. Now, unfortunately, we saved money in landscaping, lighting, and sidewalks and asphalt kind of on the west end. But then, because Fish and Wildlife had done a survey a year and a half ago on Port Orchard Boulevard, and determined that it was Johnson Creek, it had enhanced treatment, and so that added about what we took out of the other side. But again, luckily, we're not touching the culvert under Tremont at the top of Port Orchard Boulevard. If we would have touched that, we would have had to put in a barrier, fish barrier free, which at that point would have just wiped us out. So we dodged that bullet because we're not touching it at all. But yeah, it's just kind of every day. It's like 1 step forward, 2 step back, just kind of keep moving until we can get to bids. So we've done everything we can do.
I think council can be assured that we have done everything we can to minimize the cost of the project.
Right. We have
I have sat in at some of these meetings, and there's been a lot of work done.
Right. We got one little contingency, but it's still moving in the right direction in that there's a tiny little area that we need a core permit for. We're moving ahead as if we're not gonna get the core permit, and we're having to bridge the sidewalk over this small little finger of wetland, and that's adding about $50,000 of cost. Now, the chances of us getting that core permit are very, very good. We're probably gonna have it here in the next few weeks. Change order number one for the project is to remove that cantilever sidewalk and just continue with the wall and build it, and that's gonna save us about $50,000. So in there's almost like a $50,000 contingency right there. So we're being as conservative as we can.
So we're good.
Yes, so we just saved 50 grand. All right, let's get this meeting back on track here. Next item on the agenda is the energy audit. And I kind of prepared, there's a fabulous document that was prepared for us. I prepared an executive summary of it that I'll go over. And just to kind of refresh everybody's memory, we did a space analysis of the building. Middle of last year, we determined that we're quite crowded in this building, that it's the most cost-effective solution long-term is to add on to this building. We can't afford to do that right now. It's about about $8 million?
On the
City Hall expansion?
Yeah.
I want to say $8 million. I'm just from the top of my head. Short term, we've bought, a building over here where it's not more efficient to have satellite offices, but you got to do what you can afford to do. And so we bought that building for $225,000. We're hoping to put more than about $100,000 into it. 125 was the last bid, so somewhere in that neighborhood. Get us down the road, 5, 7, hopefully no more than 10 years. And so with that being said, we had an energy audit. We know we've got a roof, it's not leaking, but it's not far. It'll probably get us in that time frame, probably no more. We have extremely bad windows and siding. And we've got a problematic boiler system. We had 3 evacuations of City Hall last year because of the big boiler burping gas back into the building.
We had a leaky solenoid.
So we think we got that fixed. In reading my executive summary here, you'll see that over 50% of this report of the savings can come from our HVAC system. Okay, we don't know. Last year we had the folks that are servicing our equipment telling us we need to buy $90,000 worth of boilers. I'm not convinced that the person that's going to sell me those boilers should, that's the best advice. We need to do some more due diligence there. We're close to bringing a contract to the council that will, from an outside firm, that will evaluate our boilers and tell us what the useful life of those boilers are. If we can reasonably expect to get 5 to 7 more years out of the existing boilers, that is the best scenario. Because as you can see when we expand City Hall, the most efficient heating system that runs coils to the ground, and it goes away from these boiler systems. Okay, but we've got to be able to get our heating system that we have to when we expand City Hall. So if we can't get our boilers that many years down the road, then we've got money in the budget to replace the boilers. It's not ideal. Basically, we would have a more modern heating system in the new wing, and then we would heat and cool this system with the existing boilers because we bought $90,000 worth of boilers. The challenge of that, the systems will fight each other a little bit, and we're just better off to have one modern system in the whole building. So let's assume, we're going to do that due diligence work.
Rob, is it possible to put the new system in for the existing capacity that can accommodate the expansion?
Not really, because we have to tear up this whole parking lot, and we have some wells out here we have to decommission. It's a big deal to install what we have to install. So it's cost prohibitive, is what I was told. If we can get the mileage out of our existing boilers for about $10,000, we have a lot of, when they came in and looked at our system, there's sensors in the ductwork. So you can be in Mark's office where the sun is, and it's blazing hot over there, and you can be over on my side of the building, and it's very, and the system's not keeping up. It's cold. And from office to office, it varies. There's a lot of sensors within our ductwork and there's heating coils, like electric heating coils to augment the heat. Primarily, the heat's coming from the boiler, but to balance things out, there's sensors, and a lot of these things aren't functioning properly or even functioning at all. So they're telling us $10,000. I think we'll be lucky to get it done. But the problem is, virtually everybody in this building is so uncomfortable. They've got space heaters. We're opening windows over here to try to cool this space off because we're too hot over there. Our heating, we need to have it come in and have this system recommissioned. But we don't want to put the money, we can't afford to do that if we have to put all of our money into the boilers. So that's step one. What's the useful life of these boilers? If we can get another 5 to 7 years out of them, then I'm comfortable bringing back a recommendation to have this work to upgrade our current system, rebalance the system. There's some other things easy fixes we can do. Weatherization of doors. This last one, they made a recommendation we have a boiler and then we have a recirc system. So the water is constantly, so that you go to a faucet, there's always hot water right there. They're saying to modify that and turn that off. But we have a police department that's here 24/7. They come downstairs to process evidence, go to wash up their hands. Do we want them waiting? The savings wasn't huge on that. I'm not convinced that we should take that step. They're saying, that we should make some modifications to that. This building is open 24 hours a day, even though some of the office spaces aren't. There are portions of the building that are. Some long-term fixes that they recommend: replace our windows. We kind of knew that our windows were failing. They list them as short-term fixes. I think that's a long-term fix. They want us to add, we need additional insulation when they expose the walls. Just modern construction is different than what we have. There's an additional insulation barrier they're recommending. So when we go to replace the siding, we're going to definitely want to add additional insulation to the walls. And then we're a good candidate for solar, but there's no point if we know the roof is 7 years, you don't put solar panels on and then 7 years later go put a new roof on. So that's a long term. And then LED lighting, they said in particular the summer months, our lighting, the type of fluorescent fixtures they are, generate a tremendous amount of heat. And so we'll save in our cooling bill in this building by replacing with LED light fixtures. But that's probably a long-term fix, and we would make it part of a remodel. There is, as we get Tremont behind us and some other things, we'll have City Hall paid off in 2 years. I think it's going to be very important for us not to spend that what we're paying in debt service on our City Hall, some other means that we continue to reinvest in this building or save for that expansion of City Hall. The north half of the building, where my office, the finance department doesn't get added onto. Maybe we're gonna do some windows or some siding on some sides of the building or something, at some point. Could be a good, you know, but we're 2 or 3 years down the road for even think about that. We've got to get Tremont behind us. The most immediate things are just some weatherization of some doors, and looking at our heating system are some things that I know we can afford in the current year, and the biggest piece is about having our boilers evaluated, which we're gonna do that probably in the next 60 to 90 days. So, questions?
Do you have an estimate on what it would cost to replace the lights?
I haven't, I didn't go that far.
And that was kind of tied into my question, is must it wait until you, or just a good idea, or is it a funding issue?
Cash flow.
Okay.
You know, I would say, let's have that conversation when we pay off. Maybe that's a good use of the cash flow from the debt payments that we're making on City Hall right now, is we put that back into improvements on portions of the building we know we're not gonna remodel. You know, that's lighting in this chamber, in the offices that we know that won't be disturbed. But it's a cash flow issue at this point. All of our horses are going into what we just heard here this evening. So beyond our heating system, I think we should just kind of park this to the side. It's great information. There's some good fixes we can make, and beyond our heating, like I said, beyond our heating system, you know, the windows are bad in the winter.
One of the things, I mean, PSE has grant programs to make buildings more efficient. And,
Yes.
you know, things like lighting, even if we did it a room at a time, every time you make that improvement, you're also saving in your power bill on a monthly basis. So
Yep.
it's not something that we would necessarily, unless PSE has grant funding that would encourage us to do that we would have to do, you know, all of City Hall or half of City Hall, or whatever we can do, road and pond.
I think whether it's lighting or some siding on 1 or 2 sides of the building, I think those are conversations in our 2019 biennial budget that we can definitely entertain, because I don't think realistically we're adding on to this building in the next 5 years. You know, we've got a lot on our plate right now, financially and from a staff standpoint.
One of the things I observed in this Puget Sound Energy Comprehensive Building Tune-Up is it says it's for buildings that are 50,000 square feet or larger, buildings or campuses. We're nowhere near that.
I think he just pulled something off PSE's website. That came from the consultant. There are grants and things that we can pursue. I don't think they're gonna pay for all of our lighting upgrades, but I think we can.
They pay a fairly substantial amount.
McConaughey, didn't we have a conversation with McConaughey?
We did, and from a lighting standpoint, we're not gonna save that much, is what we were told. It's the cooling and the type of lights we have.
Regardless, it's an energy
It's
expense.
an energy expense, it is, that's right. And what I found interesting too is, I just assumed that, you know, we shouldn't have windows that open, and the architect says, no, that's just, it's part of the, you know, on a mild day, that's how we should be ventilating the building, but,
It's the management of the window opening, that's the tricky part.
yeah.
It's the management of the space heaters.
Yeah,
When it's 80 degrees in the building and everybody's complaining about it being too hot, you still have 25% of the staff that have a blanket and a heater going because they want it 90 degrees, or people that want it 67 degrees, and they've got air conditioning in the window blowing. There's also not only the building staying at a moderate temperate zone, but then there's a lot of different preferences that I've noticed.
Microclimates.
yeah, we need to, but right now, this building is just, it's all over the place, so it's tough to manage that when we're not providing a comfortable work environment.
Yeah, my office fluctuates from 67 to 80 routinely. Even in the winter, if the sun comes out, it'll get really hot, but if the wind blows, because of the windows being on that southwest corner, it'll instantly cool down to like 68, 67, so.
Janine's office, so she has a middle office, blows cold air year-round. So she's in there in the middle of winter and the AC's blowing and there's nothing we can do about it.
That was
What we found over at the transit building is that when somebody has their space heater on, it triggers the AC to come on. So it's kind of defeating, and the AC isn't just right over that desk, it's over a section of the building, so.
So we know we've got to make some fixes and then we can make some policy directives as far as space heaters. But it's tough to do that right now when we can't provide a comfortable work environment. So anyway, so enough on that. The Code City discussion. So we had this at our last council meeting. I think it was an interesting for all of us that we learned that, by and large, we can transfer our current code forward. We can pick away at pieces of it, or we can, so that there's a lot. We have a lot more latitude and options than we initially thought. It isn't as large of an undertaking from an attorney time. Sharon, we had some additional questions. And do you want to talk to your memo that you prepared? Or?
Sure, yeah, so at the city council meeting last week, there were 3 topics on the decision points list that Mayor Protem put together about things that the city might consider doing if Code City decision is reached. And so there wasn't a whole lot of information on those, so there were 3 in particular, the annexation petitions, the initiative and referendum topic, and the LID assessment collection deferral. Those are all things that are available to code cities that are not currently available to second-class cities. And so I put together just some additional information about those 3 topics. The annexation petition for election method. RCW 3513 is the heart of the cities and towns code statutory section that talks about annexation and what power cities have to annex property outside of the city limits. And the only difference in going from second-class city to code city is the number of, or the percentage of voter signatures you have to have on a petition for annexation. So that's pretty short explanation, but that really is the only difference, and there are no other differences in how the city would go about annexing property.
And we've never, this particular, there's multiple annexation methods. This particular method, we've never exercised by putting something on the ballot. It's always been the property owners bringing it, which I don't believe that method changes. This is if we were gonna take annexing all of Parkwood into the city, and it was gonna be a ballot measure. And so the threshold, lowers the threshold for that petition if someone wanted to do it we wanted to utilize that methodology.
To get it to a ballot, right?
To get it to a ballot, correct.
So, but this isn't us initiating, this is them initiating.
That's the voters.
It's voters, yeah,
Okay.
someone circulating
So
a
like if East
petition.
Port Orchard wanted to be annexed to the city, they'd only need 10% of the population, or voters, instead of 20%.
Or voters of the last
Okay.
election.
So
And then
it's
it would,
easier for them to get it on.
get it on a ballot.
Right,
You
that
know,
wouldn't approve the annexation, that would just move it forward to a
Just get
ballot.
it to a ballot. We don't have any say either way, though, in an election, obviously. The election is binding.
You get a vote too.
If we're not in that area being annexed, though.
No,
I
it
mean,
would be
City-
voting
I think it was city.
the general public. For an,
even
right.
the people
The-
not in the annexed area?
Correct, because this is
Understand.
telling us there are 2 ways. One is a direct petition from those people that live in that area. And then there's a general election one where they need to get 10% signatures of the people that voted in the last municipal election. And then that goes on the ballot for the whole city to vote on.
And currently the threshold is 20% to get it on the ballot.
What's the second part? Are you saying the existing city would have to approve the portion being annexed if they want to be in? Because that's not what's happened in the past.
No,
we
this
don't.
is separate. This is
Okay.
a
Different method.
second method.
Okay.
Yeah, that we don't use.
Well, that we Never
Haven't
used.
We have
haven't
haven't
used.
In years past, those wanting to annex, they've done it themselves.
It's just
They've done
them.
enough
They
of
get to
the
decide,
property
yeah.
owners say, we would
Yeah.
like to do this.
Yeah.
But there's another method that, as a city as a whole, to put on a ballot measure and
If there happens to be an area that maybe doesn't have a whole lot of property owners or that maybe would be in the best
yeah,
interest of the
they
city.
could all be absentee or something and not, who knows?
It's another tool that's available.
But I didn't see that as a decision point. That was just a clarification, because it comes with the code
Correct.
city.
Right, yeah, I'm just talking about that.
Right.
Yeah, what are the
Yes.
major differences?
Out of curiosity, how many voters did we have in the last election?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
3,000, do you remember? 6,000?
Last gen,
No, it was,
11 or 12,000.
I thought it was
The invoice, yeah, I have the invoice downstairs.
12,000 in the city?
It was pretty high, that was pretty
We
shocking.
don't have
We have
12,000 voters in the city.
13,850.
I know,
No.
that's what they billed us for it, so I don't know.
that's not
No,
right.
no, it was, no, it was around 8,000 something.
Yeah,
It was
Multiple
8,000,
that sounds right.
567 or something. It was,
I think Cindy's right, it's about 8,000.
yeah,
No
little
offense.
almost.
That was the alternative invoice.
I think it's even less than that, actually.
All right,
All right, so
so,
I'm gonna skip over the initiative and referendum because it's a lengthier discussion.
but that is an option, the first one is not.
It's not optional.
It just happens, it just happens,
Right.
because you're a code city. The next one is an option, and it can be either done councilmatically, or it can be done by a petition,
Or later, or whatever.
or at a later date.
Right, exactly. The LID assessment collection deferral is another thing that just happens automatically. You don't have to adopt anything, but because the codes, the optional municipal code allows code cities to have all the powers of any other city, the city would then have the powers of first-class cities with regard to LID assessment collection deferral. So economically disadvantaged persons, you wouldn't have to necessarily collect for local improvement districts from them, or you could defer collection.
Can we talk a little bit about what that actually means? It sounds like you'd be in contract with the city essentially for a deferral, but a deferral until when?
The next sale of the property, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't looked that far into it.
There's an RCW.
Yeah,
that
I
defines
saw
it.
that. but
It's not anything
I'm curious.
we're getting to decide, it's definitely defined in that
Yeah.
RCW.
Yeah, but I'm not sure they go into that much detail about exactly how long you would defer it.
Yeah, it's just,
Or
it's
if it's
open-ended
like
to me
permanent.
without going into the RCW.
Yeah.
And I can't recall,
Do it
Mr.
that way.
Clausen, when was the last time we did an LID?
Well, we've done ULIDs, but not LIDs. ULIDs, we
Was
did
the sewer
the
treatment plant.
treatment.
94, we did the ULID 6, which brought sewer out to McCormick.
Right,
Well, it's
and
not-
the original construction of the treatment plant in '83 was a ULID.
But I would imagine that would be included under a regular LID, regardless of whether it's a utility
Pretty
or.
much, no matter what project you're
Yeah.
funding.
Yeah.
Scott, the last sentence of the statute talks about, it's in the manner specified in the ordinance for the permit. So it would be, the city ordinance would describe, I can take into account the particular situation and describe how long it would be deferred.
So,
That's my
so
guess.
it sounds like it's at the discretion of our code, and we would need to, if we chose to do that, we would we would have a public process and put that in.
Sounds like that when you set your LID roles is when you determine the assessment on a piece of property. If you can defer the assessment, it sounds like they're completely deferred from the LID project.
It could be, yeah.
For 30 years?
Well, however long the project is.
Yeah.
Well, the last part of the statute talks about it's deferred upon assurance of property security for payment thereof. So there is a security instrument in place.
I'm just curious.
Right.
There's going to be some
So
further
if the property refinanced or if the property sold.
Sold or something like that, yeah, it's still an assessment against the property, because they don't have to pay it.
Right.
I do have the voter registration costs, or active and inactive voters for 2016 for City of Orchard was 9,106.
Wow.
That's active voters. but
That's active
not-
votures, that's not
That's
how
how
many.
many
That's not how
people
many.
vote.
Actually voted.
Gotcha,
they're billing you on as the active, because they have to send a
Yeah,
bill.
send
Yes,
Exactly.
whether they return it or
We
not.
need 10% of
So
it.
we were adding up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably a third of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so, I mean, there's a number of things, like Alan and I have been talking, so here would be, this is a draft of Title III, which is the finance policies, okay? And Alan would need to, it's, Title III as it stands right now will work. It will, and right now, Alan's quite busy with the folks that were at the end of the table, okay? But before he retires at the end of the year, he's committed to me that he would rework Title III and we would take advantage of some of the things that we were discussing where the clerk's no longer signing the check, they're checks, they're not warrants. Because our code will work the way that it is right now. It'll be more efficient if we redraft. So we can tackle this 60 days after we come, or
A year later.
or a year later, or 2 days later, or at the same time. We have a lot of flexibility. It's gonna be more efficient to operate in a more modern fashion, but what we're doing is working, and
Is that applicable to all of our
yes,
policies?
yes, yeah, that's what that's right, you were out of town at a
Yes.
business that meeting, so, yeah, we learned that our current code will roll forward, and we're allowed to this chapter 3513, is that what it is? Or the
The optional municipal code is chapter 35A.
35A, so it allows us to do anything any other city that we're allowed of our size. So as we grow, our authorities grow, but we can also do additional things, with our code, like our own policies within our code, that make sense for our community.
And the initiative and referendum are an option that we can
Right.
execute.
And I've included in the materials a pretty nicely detailed document that NRC put together on the powers of initiative and referendum. And the short story is that most big cities have not adopted these powers. There's a section at the very beginning of that publication that talks about the arguments for and against. And it's really just a policy decision on the part of the city council whether this is something that makes sense. It's something that the voters can also bring forward. So even if the council decided, we don't want to do this, the voters could. And so it's good to know that if moving to code city status, that's an option, it's a possibility that the voters might bring that forward. So but basically it's empower people to bring forward laws and repeal laws, and the initiative is for bringing forward new laws before the voters, and a referendum is to once an ordinance has been adopted by city council, there can be a petition to put that on the ballot before it goes into effect. And so it gives the voters a little bit more power in the system.
Who
And
pays for the elections?
the city.
So theoretically, we could have an issue on every election that we have to pay for,
Theoretically.
theoretically.
Yeah, I think so.
There's signatures.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand that part, that we're obligated to pay for the election.
But it's important to note that there are certain decisions by the city council that are not subject to referendum, and so there's a list of the types of, it's on page 44 of the packet. There are a list in the optional municipal code, including ordinances that were initiated by petition, emergency ordinances, those for local improvement districts, ordinances appropriating money, providing for approving collective bargaining, providing for compensation of or working conditions of city employees, and ordinances authorizing or repealing the levy of taxes. So those are not subject to referendum. Those are the kind that the city needs to have the authority to make decisions on without additional input from the voters. So I don't want to unduly just read all these materials for you. They're pretty succinct. They give you a good idea of which city, they have a list of which code cities have adopted these powers, but they note that most code cities have not yet. These are not powers that are available to second-class cities at all, so if the city decides to stay a second-class city, this wouldn't be an issue. So,
The biggest tool that we're lacking in our toolbox is, I don't believe we have the authority to enter into a development agreement. And that's a big deal to some of the folks out there that want to invest in our community. And it provides certainty to the developer, and it provides certainty to the city and its citizens what they're going to get in return for that investment that the developer's going to make. And we're allowed that tool in our toolbox as a city. There's a number of things that we can benefit from, but now we don't have to wholesale change our code on day one. I'm kind of of the opinion we gotta manage the workload and manage our priorities. And I think as situations and the needs arise, we tackle, the code, modernize our code section at a time. I know the development regulations have been going through a year-long process, and they're being formatted in a manner that will dovetail right into this. We're gonna have a public hearing, or it's proposed, we're gonna have a public hearing, open one, for this topic at our next council meeting. Is everybody still comfortable with that process? And you could continue it to the next meeting, depending on the testimony we get.
just to make sure, Jonathan, to speed on this, that the optional municipal code allows everything in our code to move forward unless it's in direct conflict with the optional municipal code. And so I did an initial review, and it looks like there isn't a whole lot, but I would recommend doing a code section by code section review. Just make sure there aren't anything lurking in there that are.
Would that need to be done before we take action or after? Can it be done after?
Implementation.
It'd be once you've decided, then I can start going through and making sure those are ready to go through. I don't anticipate there's going to be a lot, but I think it makes sense to.
So the last meeting of March, if we took action, that would be the last date. If we needed to get this on the ballot, then we could take action on it. And that would start a 90-day clock, which Sharon would need then in that 90 days to get all of that review done, so that when 90 days later, but roughly July 1st, we would take action to become a code city. And then her review and tweaks to our code would need to be made that were in conflict.
So come July 1, when we drop the gavel on we want to be a code city, when does that take effect? July 1?
I believe it does. I believe it does take effect on the.
That's a good question.
Right, it might be 5 days later,
Why would
but.
we,
Yeah.
Why would we wait till July 1 to take
Because it has
action?
to, from the meeting in March, when we initiate the process, it's a 90-day period for petition to be, if someone wanted for this to be on the ballot. If our community said, we want this on, this is city
Right.
council, we don't want you to do this councilmatically. The petition was
That I understand.
so that's a 90-day clock.
Okay, so we can't become a code city until that 90
End of
days
that
is
90 days.
But we would make the decision the end of March that it is our intent to be a code city at
Correct.
the end of those 90 days.
You'd adopt a resolution at the end of March, and then you'd adopt an ordinance at the end of June.
At the end of June, okay.
It's actually.
if we waited longer to start it, then we would miss till the next election cycle.
Correct, no, I get that. I didn't realize that we couldn't actually become a code city until the 90 days had passed.
So that's why, when I asked, there's very little chance that we'll be a code city before the bond issuance. So we
Correct.
have to have a huge hiccup in Tremont, because we're talking June.
Right.
To go out and borrow the money, and then the soonest this could be, and then it could potentially be on the November ballot.
My opinion is this. My opinion is if our code can come over with Sharon going through it, my opinion is, I would prefer just to bring that code over the way it is and not mess with any of the optional things we can do, because I don't think we have time to vet them between now and the end of March. And I would prefer to go through a more extensive vetting of those issues. And so we could just talk about that at our retreat and maybe come up with some time schedule for vetting those things. One of the items I was interested in is we can have a council member pro tem. And I would like to talk about that. But again, I don't know if I'm for it or against it. I just want to talk about it. And I don't think there's time between now and the end of March.
I tend to agree. I mean, we could get there and we could change a whole bunch of stuff. It's just, it's staff time, attorney time, and our time with all of the other things we've, got on our plate. And Tremont has got to be our #1 priority. And this is important to the future of our city, but I think we can tackle 1 or 2 at a time, or 5 at, whatever components we want to change and go through a process to change, or sections of our code. The financial policies, we can bring that forward by itself, in October, or whatever date, works for our work schedule and staff's, time. But Tremont's got to be, our #1 priority.
I'd just like to say that I wasn't sure what a first-class city was, because a lot of the rhetoric has been people don't want to be a second-class city. So you think, okay, we're no longer a second-class city. Does that automatically make you a first-class
Oh,
city?
no.
And the answer is no.
No.
There is a difference between first-class and
Yeah.
code
Code
city.
city.
And it's nice to know that the first-class cities have initiative and referendum. The code cities generally do not.
Yeah, they have that ability to do that, but most of them have chosen not to adopt that.
So it's funny, if this were going for a vote, people would say, well, I don't want to be a second-class city. Well, it's like, you're not becoming a first-class city by voting against it.
No, that's just, those titles were established
Usually third class.
based,
Yeah.
right, based on
No,
population.
It was just sort of amusing.
Yeah.
Right,
It's like,
misleading.
Mhm.
Okay, so we're gonna open a public hearing next week and continue then with the goal, based on what testimony we get and input we get, that we would bring this small code forward for consideration at the end of March. And then the next one says Mark, but I'm not gonna let Mark talk because it's not really Mark, and he'll have us here till 9 o'clock, so this is.
you lose.
This is really Nick's deal. I mean, Nick's out of town on vacation. So, in a nutshell, we adopted the property tax abatement last year. And we have somebody that is going to bring a project forward. And we realized we didn't have an application, nor did we have a fee to process that application. And so our fee resolution needs to be adopted or modified at next week's council meeting. And that was the Reader's Digest version.
Thank you, Mark.
So,
Is that fee a deposit amount that goes up with more hours, or
That's the full amount.
that's, okay,
so we didn't have to
it's
have
a flat.
technical expertise there. So, it'll
I
be the same.
did have something to say.
Okay, well, go ahead.
That this is a current revision just to take care of this issue that we didn't have it in place, but we're also looking at fees in general again. I know we just did this, but we have this recent project, Stetson Heights, and they're questioning our fee schedule. And so we're gonna go back and we're evaluating that. They actually may be too low in some areas, so.
And that particular one might be too high for the size of the stormwater.
Yeah, it's tricky because we're looking at how other people do it. Some people do it upfront in site development and then separately for the houses. Some people do it all together, so we didn't want to rush. We were gonna try to get it on this agenda, so no, we need to research this. So there will be another amendment to the fee schedule coming up.
The project going forward, unfortunately, isn't the Kmart site, but it's close by.
Kmart's not gonna be storage.
That's came and went and came, and I'm not sure.
Maybe not.
When will we learn
It hasn't-
the nature of this project, Mr. Mayor?
Hmm?
When will we learn?
When they apply. They haven't officially applied, but they've let us know, and they're interested in this tool. And they wanted to know where the application was in our, and we said,
Always.
we need one of those.
We'll go get it.
We'll go get it, that's right.
We'll let you know how much it costs.
And we'll let you know how much it
Trust
costs,
us.
that's right.
Yeah.
So-
It'll be in the mail.
Along with the check.
So, anything else for the good of the order? Okay, meeting's adjourned.
We need to decide on a time for our land use committee meeting.
And Clancy,
Yes.
are
That
we
was
all
nice
set
of them
up
to get out at
on
9:15.
I was,
at a
Mark, I was just
convention?
gonna ask.
Here, I don't know the urgency of
Want
trying
to
to
tell
happening
me
on the
that,
tip
or
next
do
week
you
versus
want us to find someone?
3 weeks.
No.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
When does Nick get